billionaire ordered in a foreign language to humiliate the waitress. Her reply left the entire restaurant in tears. The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor a full 3 seconds before anyone in the restaurant understood why. And by the time the sound stopped echoing off the vaulted ceiling, 26-year-old Amara Collins was on her knees in a $500 dress that wasn't hers, picking up shards of crystal with her bare hands while a man worth $11 billion watched her bleed and smiled. That single moment, cruel, public, and utterly unnecessary, was about to become the moment that changed everything. Not because of what he did to her, but because of what she said back. If you believe kindness can survive even in the coldest rooms, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that grace is stronger than money. And subscribe to Kindness Corner so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to where it all began. Amara had been working at Le Méridien, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, for just over a year. It was the kind of place where the wine list cost more to print than most people made in a week, where reservations were booked 8 months in advance, and where the staff were trained to be invisible unless summoned, present enough to refill a glass before it emptied, absent enough that a guest could forget they existed at all. Amara had learned to master that invisibility. She had to. It was the only thing standing between her and the rent she couldn't afford, the tuition payments still hanging over her from a nursing degree she'd never gotten to finish, and the small apartment she shared with her 8-year-old brother, Micah, whom she had raised alone since their mother passed 3 years earlier. She never talked about that at work. Nobody there knew that after her double shifts she went home to help a 3rd grader with his homework, to burn dinner because she was too exhausted to cook properly, to lie awake doing math in her head that never quite worked out. All they knew was that Amara showed up early, stayed late, remembered every regular's order, and never once complained. Her manager, a stern but not unkind woman named Denise, had once told her, "You have more patience than anyone I've ever hired." Amara had simply smiled and said patience wasn't a virtue when it was the only thing you had left. That Thursday evening, the restaurant was hosting a private dinner for a man named Julian Voss, a name that made the entire kitchen tense the moment it appeared on the reservation sheet. Voss was the founder of a global tech and shipping empire, a man whose net worth had been the subject of magazine covers, and whose temper had been the subject of far too many lawsuits that quietly disappeared before trial. He arrived with an entourage of assistants and business partners from overseas, all dressed in suits that cost more than the restaurant's monthly rent, and he arrived already irritated about something none of the staff would ever learn. Amara had been assigned to his table. Denise had pulled her aside beforehand and said only, "Be perfect tonight. This man could buy this restaurant and fire all of us before dessert if he felt like it." It wasn't an exaggeration. It was simply the truth of the world they worked in. For the first 20 minutes, everything went smoothly. Amara poured water without being asked, cleared plates with silent precision, and kept her expression calm even as Voss snapped at one of his assistants over something trivial. But then, as the appetizers were cleared and the main course approached, Voss turned to look at her directly for the first time all evening, not with interest, but with the particular kind of attention powerful men sometimes give to people they've decided don't matter. He said something to her, in French. Amara didn't speak French. She caught only fragments, words she recognized from a high school class nearly a decade ago. But the tone was unmistakable. It was mocking. Around the table, 2 of his business partners, who clearly did understand the language, exchanged a glance and then looked down at their plates, uncomfortable but silent. One of the assistants let out a short, nervous laugh before catching herself. Amara stood there for a moment, feeling the heat rise in her face, unsure whether to apologize for not understanding or to ask what he'd said. She chose the safer path. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't speak French. How can I help you?" Voss smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the smile of a man enjoying himself. He repeated the phrase, slower this time, clearly for effect, clearly so that everyone at the table could appreciate the joke at her expense. Everyone except her. Then, switching to English with theatrical patience, as though speaking to a child, he said, "I asked whether the restaurant trains its staff, or whether they simply hire whoever walks in off the street. I was testing you. You failed." A ripple of uncomfortable silence moved through the private dining room. One of the younger assistants shifted in her seat. Somewhere near the kitchen door, another server froze mid-step, watching. Amara felt something tighten in her chest. Not quite anger, something closer to a familiar, exhausted ache. The same ache she felt every time the world reminded her that she was disposable in rooms like this. But she had learned long ago that dignity wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. She kept her voice steady. I apologize for the misunderstanding, sir. I'll do better to anticipate your needs. It should have ended there. Most people would have let it end there. But Voss, perhaps bored, perhaps simply cruel in the particular way that unchecked power sometimes curdles a person, wasn't finished. As Amara turned to refill the water glasses at the far end of the table, he lifted his own glass of champagne. Full, expensive, untouched, and, with a flick of his wrist that looked almost casual, almost accidental, sent it crashing to the floor directly in her path. The sound cracked through the room. Amara stopped, glass fragments scattered across the marble at her feet. Champagne soaking into the hem of the black uniform dress she'd ironed at 5 that morning before waking Micah for school. For a moment, nobody moved. Voss looked at her with an expression of mild, performative disappointment, as though she were the one who had made the mess. Careless, he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. In my country, we teach people to watch where they're walking. It was cruelty dressed as correction, humiliation dressed as a lesson, and everyone at that table knew it. Amara knelt down without a word and began gathering the shards of glass with her bare hands. Because there was no time to find gloves. Because the floor needed to be clear before someone got hurt. Because that was simply the job. A sharp edge caught her palm and she felt the sting. Felt a thin line of blood mix with the spilled champagne. And still she kept working, calm, controlled, refusing to give him the reaction he was so clearly hunting for. It was in that moment, kneeling on the floor of a restaurant that would never remember her name, bleeding quietly in front of a man who had more money than entire nations, surrounded by people too afraid or too complicit to say anything, that Amara Collins finally looked up. Not with anger, not with tears, though her eyes were burning. She looked up at Julian Voss with a steadiness that seemed to catch him off guard, and she spoke, calm and clear enough for the entire table to hear. You ordered that in French because you assumed I wouldn't understand, and you wanted to enjoy watching me fail without consequence. That's not a test of my ability, sir. That's a test of your character. And I think everyone at this table just watched you fail it far worse than I ever could. She paused, pressing a napkin to the small cut on her palm, and continued, her voice never rising, never trembling. I've served people who left me their week's grocery budget as a tip because it was all they had, and I've served people who could buy this building and still find a way to feel small unless someone else feels smaller. I know which kind of person I'd rather be. I hope one day you figure out which kind you want to be too. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It wasn't uncomfortable in the way discomfort usually feels in expensive rooms. It was heavier, more honest, the kind of silence that happens when something true has been said in a place built to avoid the truth. One of Voss's business partners, an older man who had said almost nothing all evening, quietly set down his fork. A young assistant near the end of the table wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, unable to hide it. Even Denise, who had appeared in the doorway the moment she heard the glass shatter, stood frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth. Voss said nothing. For a man who built his fortune on always having the last word, who had spent decades in boardrooms making other people feel 2 inches tall, he simply sat there, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the young woman still kneeling on the floor in front of him with blood on her palm and champagne soaked into her dress, refusing to look away from him first. Amara didn't wait for a response. She finished clearing the glass, stood, excused herself with quiet professionalism, and walked to the back of the house to bandage her hand. She fully expected to be fired before the night was over. In a world like that one, speaking the truth to a man like Voss usually cost you everything. But something had shifted in that room that neither she nor anyone else at that table could have predicted. As she wrapped gauze around her palm in the small first aid station near the kitchen, hands still shaking now that no one was watching, Denise appeared beside her, uncharacteristically gentle. He's asking for you, she said. He wants you to come back to the table. Amara's stomach dropped. She assumed the worst. A public dismissal, one final humiliation to close out the evening, perhaps even a complaint that would follow her to every restaurant in the city. But she squared her shoulders, because that was what she always did, and walked back into the dining room. Voss stood as she approached, which was, in itself, unusual enough to draw stares from his own entourage. He didn't smile. He didn't perform an apology the way powerful men sometimes do when they've calculated the cost of bad publicity. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had lost the mocking edge entirely. "I built a company from nothing," he said quietly. "I remember what it felt like to be invisible to people who had money. I promised myself I'd never make anyone feel that way once I had it. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that promise." He glanced down at the bandage on her hand. "I'm sorry, truly. Not because of how this looks, but because you were right, and I needed to hear it from someone who had every reason not to say it to my face." He didn't stop there. In the weeks that followed, word of what happened at that dinner moved quietly through circles far beyond the restaurant. Not through gossip, but because two of the people at that table, moved by what they'd witnessed, couldn't stay silent about it. A journalist who happened to be a friend of one of the business partners heard the story secondhand and reached out to Amara for a comment. She almost said no. She wasn't looking for attention. She was looking for her next paycheck. But she agreed to a short interview, thinking little would come of it. What came of it was more than she ever imagined. Voss, in a rare public gesture that surprised even his own board, established a scholarship fund in the hospitality and nursing industries, he said in his statement, built on people who are asked to be invisible and who deserve to be seen. Amara was offered and initially refused out of pride, the very first scholarship. Full tuition to finish the nursing degree she'd abandoned 3 years earlier when her mother got sick, along with a stipend that meant, for the first time since her mother's death, she didn't have to choose between rent and Micah's school shoes. She almost turned it down. It felt too large, too sudden, too much like charity for a moment she never asked to become a headline. But her brother, sitting across from her at their small kitchen table one evening while she stared at the offer letter, said something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Mom always said the same thing you told that man, that how people treat you when you're small tells you everything about who they really are." He looked up at her, 8 years old and far wiser than he had any right to be. "Take it, Amara. Not for you. For her." She took it. Amara finished her nursing degree 18 months later, graduating with honors while still working part-time to keep their small life afloat. She now works in pediatric care at a hospital not far from the restaurant where she once knelt on a marble floor with glass in her palm. And she has never once stopped believing that the way you treat someone with nothing to offer you is the truest measure of your character. Voss, for his part, quietly funds the scholarship to this day, and though he rarely speaks publicly about that night, those close to him say it changed the way he runs every meeting, every negotiation, every interaction with the people who make his empire run. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that dignity doesn't need to shout to be powerful, that kindness can outlast even the coldest cruelty, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Kindness Corner so these stories keep finding the people who need them most. And before we close tonight, I want to ask you for something small but meaningful. In the comments below, write just one